parking lot, looking for someone parking, and some car pulled into a weird, like, back lot of, like, meters that I hope it's like, because it's what it needs. So, yeah. I don't all it has is a journal, like, 100
So welcome everybody to tonight's Northeast Maryland Technology Council Science Cafe. And this is brought to you by partnership between the NMTC and Harford County Public Libraries. Just looking ahead to next month, there are flyers by the door. We have a couple of presenters from the US Army talking about the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons. This was a very unique challenge, and they basically outfitted a ship, the MV Cape Ray, with hydrolysis units so that they actually could take these chemical agents and destroy them in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea to render them safe and harmless. So we have Brian O'Donnell and Amy Dean actually discussing some of the logistics, the chemistry behind it, and how the crew on the ship performed this task. And also Amy Dean will be providing an insight into the backup support and team that actually basically took place in Harford County supporting that mission by the Joint Project Management Elimination. So that will be on Wednesday, February the 25th. There's a couple more. Wednesday, February the 25th, 7 o'clock here at the Bel Air Library. So a couple of items of housekeeping. The main library closes at 8 o'clock, but we do have the space here till about 8:15, 8:30. If you do need to leave before about 8:15, I recommend you leave at about 8 o'clock, because after that, the front main doors are going to be closed. After the cafe's over, we actually leave through that door there. We'll lift up the screen so you don't have to limbo. But just so you're aware of the logistics, if that causes any, I guess the limbo dancer at the back there. Tune in. All right. Our partners at Cecil County Public Library also run a Science Cafe program. Their events can be found at the Cecil County Public Library website and also on the NMTC website. If you want information on Science Cafes to come to you, please give us your email address if you don't have it already, and there are cards at the back. If there are topics you'd like to see or speakers you'd like to suggest to us, please also give us that information. This is a community program, and we'd love your input and your feedback. This is a great time to silence your cell phones, and restrooms, if you need to answer a call of nature, are just out that door and to the left. I'm delighted to introduce Captain Robert Cohen this evening. Captain Cohen works with the US Army Public Health Command. He did his undergraduate work at Harvard College, medical school at Columbia, and then did a residency at Walter Reed. After Walter Reed, he then joined the US Army. He was in the US, obviously at Walter Reed. He joined the Public Health Command here at Aberdeen not so many years ago, and is working on a number of areas, mainly those with a public health focus, such as HIV and obesity. But he's been very closely following the Ebola epidemics and actually tracing them back to their genesis almost, and has some very interesting insights to share with us this evening. Welcome, Captain Cohen.
Thanks, Nina. All right, so we'll get right into it. First of all, thank you all for coming. Certainly excited to discuss this with you. The origin of this project is we were curious, where did Ebola come from? And of course, I think we all had some intuition that it came from the rainforest, but the details of exactly how it came and what it means for both prevention of future Ebola outbreaks and mitigating the damage that this particular virus is going to cause the human population, as well as what it means for possible other future viruses that are as yet unknown, are quite interesting. And it turns out there's a lot of very interesting details that can lead us to make good or bad choices depending on how we respond to it. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and this is my mandatory disclaimer now that I got you all excited. This is a gorilla family in the Losi Sanctuary of the Republic of Congo. So that is this region right here, right on the border. This is where the Losi Sanctuary is. And in 2002, they started to find that they were finding some dead gorillas, which subsequently tested positive for Ebola. And those were all these red dots. And over the period of time, there was a group of researchers who were studying gorillas anyway. And suddenly, they were not able to find any more live gorillas. They started finding dead gorillas, but they couldn't find any live ones. And this alarmed them because they were studying a fairly large population. Just prior to that, I had all these blue dots. These were human outbreaks in villages along the Gabon-Congo border. And ultimately, when they did the numbers and realized just how many gorillas were dead, this is the answer. So there were thought to be about 6,000 gorillas in this particular sanctuary. And by the end of this 1-year outbreak, 90% of them, 5,500 gorillas, had died of Ebola. And this was a big concern because there was another previous incidence of a big gorilla die-off in the same area. But other than those two, it's really unknown to the animal literature. Now let's put that in context a little bit. So this is a timeline, and I'm going to go a little slow just to get us all on the same scientific page. So this is a brief history of Ebola and Marburg, both of which are hemorrhagic viruses of the same family, very unusual, long virus. Most viruses are round. This is a very long filament. That's where the term filovirus comes from. And we had never heard of a filovirus. The scientific community had never heard of a filovirus until an outbreak in Germany in 1967 of Marburg, which is actually from Uganda and Kenya. And that was because it was from imported monkeys into Germany that they were using for scientific research. And then in 1976, we saw Ebola for the first time in 2 simultaneous outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what was then Zaire, and Sudan. And then we went through a latent period where there really was no Ebola or Marburg cases. And then in the 1990s, we started to see a lot of different outbreaks. All of these outbreaks are cases for more cases than 10. And you'll notice that the largest outbreak was this 2001 in Uganda of 400 cases. So that was up until this year. Now let's put that in context. So all of those large bars, those are these tiny little dots down here. And this is the current outbreak in West Africa with 20,000 cases, not even close to the previous outbreaks. And these are the 2 gorilla outbreaks. So these 3 are the 3 biggest filovirus outbreaks in the history of the known world. And this really, I think, should underscore the point that this is not your typical virus spillover from animals to humans. This is something new that we need to be concerned about. So this is the argument that I'm going to present you today. I'm going to show you that Ebola shows very low genetic diversity, and I'm going to explain what that means. I'm going to show you that there are many other emerging viral infections that have very low genetic diversity as well, although not quite as low as Ebola. I'm going to take you to Evolutionary Biology 101 and talk to you about the causes of low genetic diversity, which include bottlenecks, genetic drift, and then some other ones. I'm going to show you that bat populations are declining in Africa and how a genetic bottleneck could result and thereby cause low genetic diversity. I'm going to show you that biodiversity is in crisis and how this could enable the outbreak of a random virulent strain. I'm going to use the case of measles, the human virus, to resolve the dilemma between biodiversity and bat population decline. And I'm going to implicate biodiversity as the chief cause of the Ebola outbreak. And then I'm going to talk about how this is but one of several what we're going to call slow motion emergencies that are bringing about the Ebola, the large disaster that we are currently watching. And then we'll just talk briefly, because we'll almost be at the end of our time, about what this means in light of 320,000 undiscovered animal virus. That's an approximate guess how many there are. We only know a few of them. And then we'll talk even more briefly about what humans can do about it, because that's sort of a topic for another day. So this is a family tree of all known Ebola viruses that have been discovered. So what we're looking at is what happens is every time they find a dead human, gorilla, or bat, now the bats don't die, but a bat that has Ebola DNA in it, they sequence it, they put it in a computer, and you can tell based on the number of differences in the A's, T's, C's, and G's in the genetic code how many years it took to diverge between the different members of that particular virus. And because they collect these at different years and different places, and they can put it in a computer and back calculate. And I want to draw your attention, this is the mutation rate that's calculated for Ebola Zaire, and that number will actually matter. I didn't just put that up there because we like numbers. That number turns out to be quite important. And so what they've discovered, after doing all of this back calculation and genetic collection, what we discovered is that all of the known Ebola, whether from the DRC in 1977 to there's today, to Liberia in the current age, all of them come from an ancestor that's only 48 years old. So that means that all of the known Ebola came from a specimen 48 years ago somewhere in the Congo. And that's weird because these things have been around for a long time. So what does that mean? And we'll talk more. So let's talk about another Ebola. This is called Ebola Weston. Comes from the Philippines, does not infect humans, but does kill monkeys. It has killed several large populations of monkeys, including those imported to the United States. You do the same calculation, whether from viruses from pigs or from, which have been discovered on Filipino farms, or from monkeys, and what you find is that that common ancestor, this is even more recent, it's only 30 years old. Despite the fact that it's an ancient virus and the filoviruses are ancient, that evidence is clear, and we can talk about it if you like, this is a 30-year-old virus. That's weird. What is going on? Let's talk a little more. This is Marburg. Remember I mentioned Marburg is related to, it's the closest related virus to Ebola, causes similar mortality levels, and is just as unpleasant to have. They have found Marburg in a variety of places, different animals, humans, bats, and monkeys as well. And you see, this is hard to see, but a similar situation. You've got a lot of different cases from a lot of different areas and a lot of different animals, and the most recent common ancestor is a little bit older, but it's only 229 years old. So again, quite recent when you could start to consider how old some animals are, and we'll talk later about that. And again, I want to draw your attention to the mutation rate, 5.7 times 10 to the minus 4. We're all in the range of 10 to the minus 4. Let's just talk about another virus. So this is bird flu, just as scary as Ebola. In fact, I would argue actually more scary, because if it gets into the human population, we have a real problem. And that's happened before, and it's killed a lot of people. So they present their data a little differently in this paper. Again, I'll draw your attention to the mutation rate. It's actually faster than Ebola. And what they find, so these are all of the different strains of bird flu that exist in the world, and these are all the different genes that have been sequenced. And this is the age of all those genes. And what you'll notice is that the vast majority of genes in bird flu are all less than 100 years old. Again, flu's been around for a long time. So what does that mean and what's going on? Let's talk about another virus. This is dengue. Dengue is an extremely unpleasant thing to have. It's not as deadly as these other ones, but without proper medical attention, you can die from it if you catch it. It causes hemorrhagic disease, very different mechanism from Ebola. But it's not fun to have. You catch it in the tropical regions. It's all over. It's all over Central America, India, Southeast Asia. Not so much in Africa, because we have other things that are even more deadly in Africa that we're concerned about. But basically, if you look at these 4 subtypes of dengue, so there are 4. It has evolved into 4 different subspecies of dengue over time. All 4 of them, if you construct their family tree, are about 100 years old. So again, I'll draw your attention to the mutation rates, which are on the same order of Ebola. That was 7 times 10 to the minus 4. And we'll give some context for that too. But dengue 1, again, you can't quite see it here, unfortunately, but that says 1903. That's the most recent common ancestor of all known dengue 1, from mosquitoes in India to the South Pacific to the Americas. Dengue all over the world is 100 years old or less, dengue 1. Dengue 2, same thing. This goes back to about, I think this is 8, you can't really see it, unfortunately, but that's about 1900 as well. Let's scroll forward to dengue 3 and 4. You see the same story. These are a little older. This is 1870, and this is about 1850. So these are a little older, but again, we're talking in the last 100, 200 years, despite the known ancient origin of these. And by the way, the reason we know they're ancient is because we've seen the genes integrated into animal genomes. So you can find filovirus genes in animal species, because over time the virus just gets in there and the animal gets used to it. For example, bats, and you develop sort of the relationship we have with the common cold. It gets you, maybe it makes you a tiny bit sick, but eventually you become more or less, not symbiotic, but you tolerate each other, sort of like a bad marriage or something like that. But that is not what's going on with Ebola in us. It's killing us. It's not integrating seamlessly into our genome. It's killing us. And so that's the sign that it's new, right? It's new to us. So this is just a summary of what I just showed you. So we talked about the mutation rates. Again, these are Ebola Zaire, Ebola Weston, Marburg avian flu, all very fast mutating, 7.1 times 10 to the minus 4. And just to put that in context, the Ebola genome has 19,000 base pairs. If you're mutating at this rate, 19,000 base pairs, you multiply them together, that means every year Ebola is changing 14 of its base pairs, which, for those of you that have taken high school biology, that means that you're going to change the proteins that this particular thing makes, which could potentially allow it to jump to a new species or become more virulent or die. It could be a negative mutation, bad for the virus. But if it mutates that quickly, you're likely to get some really dangerous ones over that time. Now, I'll just draw your attention to some of these other viruses. This is yellow fever, which is similar to dengue, doesn't mutate quite as fast, and is much older. Its most recent common ancestor is 650. Now let's compare it to, so these are all RNA viruses. RNA viruses tend to mutate much faster than DNA viruses because they are not stabilized by the removal of a hydroxyl group. DNA viruses like human papillomavirus, just for example, you'll see mutates, this is 10 to the minus 6, mutates about 100 times slower than Ebola, and you'll see that its most recent common ancestor is 700,000 years ago. So there's a huge difference between what's going on with these RNA viruses, these fast mutating ones, and this, the slower mutating things. And then here's animals with much, much older genealogies. All right, so I've showed you that there is low genetic diversity in Ebola, as well as some other scary infections. Let's talk about why a virus might have low genetic diversity. So these are the 5 reasons. By the way, who knows who this is? Someone help me out here. Say it louder. That's right, Charles Darwin. So, this is Evolutionary Biology 101, but I'm going to walk you through what each of these different theories could be for why we're seeing low genetic diversity in Ebola. So one option is that there's low mutation rates. Just we see low genetic diversity because it's not mutating very fast. But we already talked about that RNA viruses have the fastest mutation rate known to science. So that is not it. There's something called the founder effect. So the founder effect is if for some random reason, say it jumped a new species, say from an insect to a bat, because of a random mutation, you would get a disproportionate amount of inheritance from that event, and therefore it would have all of the different descendants of that, if it happened recently, would be from this one specimen that had jumped species, thereby creating low genetic diversity. A good example of that is the Afrikaners from the Netherlands who colonized South Africa. There was a very small group of them that wound up being the ancestors of most of the people in South Africa. And so if you look at the Afrikaners, they have a higher rate of Huntington's disease, which is an extremely rare disease, but they have a relatively high rate of it because the founders just happen to have it. It's a random event. That could be the reason that we're seeing low genetic diversity in Ebola if it had recently jumped from an insect. We think it's probably not this because if you experimentally infect bats with Ebola, they tolerate it just like we tolerate the common cold. No other animal does that. And that, in other words, they get infected, it doesn't kill them, they shed virus, and it's fine. Other animals, it either kills them or it doesn't infect them. So that is pretty strong evidence that bats are the reservoir. And again, we found Ebola and Marburg in bats, as well as many other bad viruses. So they're very good hosts for a lot of different viruses. And that's evidence that it's been with bats for a long time. So it's probably not a founder effect. Now, selection bias. Maybe we're just catching the parts of these viruses that jump into humans. So maybe there's only a small subset of the very large Ebola soup that's out there, but we're only seeing the ones that can jump to humans, and that's a very small group. So we know that's not the case because, again, if you look at some of these very complex family trees, you find strains identified in the wild, whether in a mosquito or in a bat, and they fit right in our family tree. It's not like they're way off millions of years distance. They fit right in. So it's not selection bias either. So it really comes down to a dilemma of the following 2. The genetic bottleneck and the coalescent process from genetic drift. I'll define that. So most of the papers published on this say that, well, probably Ebola underwent a genetic bottleneck recently. Let's talk about what a genetic bottleneck means. This is a population of bats in Africa. There is one, they have many different Marburg or Ebola strains circulating in them at any given time, and only one of them, this one in red, can infect humans. The others don't, and in any population of bats, if you capture them, draw their blood, and check for antibodies, we find that only about 10% of them are infected at any given time. So this is approximately what the viral load would look like if you had a very wide genetic diversity and a lot of different strains. Now let's say you have a bunch of hunters come around and they kill 20% or 80% of your bats. Now this has happened in Africa. The bat population has declined by catastrophic numbers. You can see that if you randomly kill 80% of the bats, you might, by chance, eliminate most of the strains and wind up with only strain number 3. If the next group of bats is born, because they reproduce fairly quickly, that would be the only one left. And that's called a bottleneck. It's not a natural selection process, it's not evolution. It's a random event from humans showing up with guns. But you can imagine that if instead they killed the wrong 80%, instead of getting strain 3, which is no problem, you would suddenly have a predominance of strain number 1, and thereby explain why you have all the bats with the same bad strain. So that's what's commonly proposed for why you see low genetic diversity in Ebola. Now let's talk about genetic drift. So the bottleneck explanation turns out to be wrong, and this turns out to be right, and we'll explain why. So that's a piece of driftwood to sort of underscore the point. So for those that have taken high school biology, genetic drift means that over time, fast mutating populations can change not through natural selection, where they're directed through survival and natural selection, but just through random chance. It changed, a particular base pair change, does not good, not bad for the virus, but it just changes, and then over time it sort of coalesces, it's called the coalescent process, into a predominant new set of low genetic diversity viruses that all have come from this thing that just randomly wound up to dominate. Now, in order to have this happen, you need 2 additional factors, one of 2. You either need very few people in the population that this random, or viruses, that this random strain can come to dominate everything, or you need what's called a low effective population size, which means that it's easy for the virus to spread throughout every member of the species. And to do that, you need all species to, in theory, be in contact with each other, all members of the same good host species, because not every virus is well hosted by every species. So you need one of those 2 things, a low actual population or low biodiversity, other species getting in the way of propagation of the bad strain. So let's talk about biodiversity a little bit, because it's a problem. It's in crisis today. So this is a map of biodiversity, and biodiversity is one of those words that, what does it really mean? It's one of those fuzzy words that even environmentalists look here and maybe they don't necessarily know how to define it. It just means different types of species. So not surprisingly, it's highest in the tropics. This is a map of all the different types of species of birds and mammals, and other groups of organisms look the same way. It's very high in the Amazon and Central Africa and Southeast Asia. Now, if you look at what percentage of these species are threatened with extinction, it is also in the tropics. Southern Brazil, Indonesia, Southeast Asia is probably the worst place in the world right now, and so some significant threats in Africa as well. So in order to talk about the biodiversity argument, I need to take a little bit of a tangent and tell you about another virus called Hantavirus. Hantavirus is a scary virus that you don't want. It causes Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. So that is a normal chest x-ray. That's what you look like if you're perfectly healthy. That's what all of your chest x-rays would look like. That's what your chest x-ray looks like if you have Hantavirus. It's full of fluid, and you have a 40% chance of mortality. I would draw your attention to its mutation rate, just as fast as the other ones. And I would also point out to you that it comes from rodents, and humans contract it by breathing aerosolized rodent feces or urine. So if you get it, you can guarantee that you inhaled droplets of rodent excrete. And it's really scary, and it's all over the Americas. It's in South America, it's in North America, and actually it's all over the old world as well, although it's a slightly different strain of the different hantaviruses. So we're going to talk about hantavirus in the Americas to explain how biodiversity matters. So there were 2 studies, one in Oregon and one in Utah. And what they did is they looked at whether hantavirus spread more quickly in a setting of low biodiversity. So hantavirus has co-evolved with its host. There are many different rodents, but a particular hantavirus will only infect one particular rodent. Now, so on the left here, what you see is the biodiversity on the x-axis, so more different species. And on the y-axis, you see the infection prevalence in the good host species, in this case, the deer mouse. And what you see is a pretty strong correlation. At high biodiversity, the prevalence rate is very low. The hantavirus has not made its way around. And at setting of low biodiversity in Oregon, the infection rate among deer mice has actually risen very high. Now, why would that be? So let's talk about the study in Utah. So there are 2 possibilities. One is that there just aren't that many mice in a low biodiverse setting. There aren't that many mice to propagate the virus. Or the other option is we've killed off all the other rodents that would get in the way of interspecies interaction by which you would propagate the virus. And therefore, by killing off all the other animals, you would be able to, those individual deer mice would meet other deer mice more frequently. It's called the dilution effect, and therefore propagate the virus completely, and therefore have a coalescent process whereby one dominant strain comes to overwhelm the entire population because everything can interact with everything else. And what we find is that it is the latter that is the case. So this bottom graph is just deer mouse density. How many deer mice are there? And we don't see a relationship. You see there's no line. If there's lots of deer mice or no deer mice at all, you see similar rates of intraspecies competition and interaction, no matter the deer mice population. But if you decrease species diversity, you see that the percentage of intraspecific interaction, the same deer mice interacting with members of its own species, thereby increasing the ability to propagate the virus, we find that you see a significant increase in the number of intraspecific interaction, and therefore also they found that infection prevalence went up too. Now these are observational studies. Let's talk about an experiment to prove the dilution effect. So this occurred in Panama. What they did is they said, well, let's try it. Let's try trapping and getting rid of the animals that are bad hosts for hantavirus, and let's only leave the ones that are good hosts. Let's see if infection prevalence goes up. So this is where they were before and after. The black is the good host for the virus. The gray is the bad host. They trapped and removed from the wild enough species to change the biodiversity of the setting. And what they found is that this is mean density of seroprevalence, so that's infected individuals, infected mice. And what they find is that after you remove the other rodents that are not hosts for this particular hantavirus, the infection prevalence goes up by a factor of at least 4. You remove the animals that get in the way, you change the ecosystem whereby they used to be separated from each other, at least in different subpopulations. You remove that, the virus propagates more easily, and the seroprevalence and the prevalence of the virus goes up significantly. And that was published in Nature. So, this is an even better story. So I want to bring it home now to eastern United States. Lyme disease. This is a beautiful series of papers that if anyone has a chance to read it, I strongly recommend it. This is probably the best biodiversity discussion that exists. So Lyme disease is a bacteria, it's not a virus, and it's carried by the tick. The tick can live on any mammal, but mammals vary in terms of their quality of hosts. Some mammals are extremely good hosts, such as the deer mouse. That's its best host, and we can tell that through a variety of issues. And other mammals, such as humans, are very bad hosts because we tend to find the tick, kill it, and have good immune systems to kill the bacteria if it's in us. Possums are also extremely good or bad hosts for Lyme disease. So what we want, if we want to control Lyme disease, is more possums and fewer mice. Unfortunately, as we have cut down trees and built cars and roads, that has, of course, preferentially selected for the species which reproduces faster and doesn't run across the road as much. So we have preferentially selected for the mouse over the possum. Now, each mouse has on it about 2,000 ticks, infected ticks. The mouse will groom off and kill about half of those ticks, leaving almost 1,000 infected ticks, they're very small, per mouse running around with Lyme disease ready to infect us. The opossum will carry far more ticks on it, 6,000-ish, but it will groom off and kill almost all of the ticks, and it has such a good immune system that it will kill the Lyme disease in the rest of them. So while the mouse, which is more populous anyway, is responsible for 900 ticks, infected ticks per hectare, the opossum is responsible for only 5 infected ticks per hectare. And they have found, they've done a series of studies that shows if you reduce the number of possums, which is happening, the number of infected mice goes up, and so does the transmission to humans. Lyme disease has only become a real problem in this area in the last 50 or so years, and it's a result of this. And again, this is a beautiful set of papers that I strongly recommend. And I want to get to the questions because that's the best part, but one more very interesting story about biodiversity, actually 2. This is the elephant mosquito, Toxorhynchites. If you see it, don't kill it. It does not bite humans. It feeds off of other mosquitoes. When it's an adult, it only drinks fruit nectar or plant nectar, goes to flowers. Doesn't affect humans at all. But when it's a larva form, you put a single larva of this mosquito in a jar of water with all the bad mosquitoes that bite us. One larva of toxorhynchites will eat all of the other larvae. Its favorite food is our least favorite mosquito, the Aedes aegypti. So what did we do in the 20th century? To try to eradicate a variety of diseases, we sprayed DDT everywhere. Toxorhynchites is bigger, reproduces slower, develops resistance to DDT slower. So our environmental policies of spraying a bunch of DDT, in addition to doing terrible things to the birds, also killed off toxorhynchites, allowing the preferential increase of the really bad mosquitoes that transmit malaria and dengue and everything and bite us and make us very unhappy more. Another case of the good animal being preferentially killed off by biodiversity decline. Now, on the next slide, I want to talk about why that is. Actually, this is just a list of other cases of the dilution effect where they find that decreasing biodiversity leads to a problem, whether from frog limb formation to different species, new species of malaria that are found to jump into humans in Indonesia, West Nile, which came to us 10 years ago, et cetera. So why is it that if you reduce biodiversity and kill off a bunch of animals, you preferentially kill off the animals that protect us? Well, it's probably two reasons. The reason an animal is a good host is because it has a poor immune system, doesn't kill the virus, and because it has a high reproductive rate and can develop resistance and can mutate and change very quickly to adapt to the changing environment. And both of those tend to go together, and the reason for that is if you're reproducing all the time like a mouse, you're not going to invest a lot of your genes and your energy in having a good immune system. And whereas vice versa, if you live a long time, such as humans, you have a great immune system that can kill a bunch of different things. And so those two things tend to go together, and so it makes sense, and there's evidence for this that we went through, that if you reduce biodiversity and you encroach on the environment, you're going to preferentially kill off the animals that get in the way of virus propagation and other disease propagation to our detriment. So let's talk about the state of biodiversity in the world today. This is the state of forests. We all hear about saving the rainforest, but this is in fact a very bleak picture. So the brown means deforested, the green means forest still the way it used to be, and the light green means it's degraded and there are roads built through it, but there's still some trees there. Look at India. India is all brown. India used to be a forest. China used to be a forest. Indonesia has cut down 90% of its rainforest. Look closer at Africa. This whole area used to be a continuous forest. And this has all been deforested. And even the Congo, where Ebola comes from here and HIV came from here. By the way, that story is also beautiful, and I'd be happy to talk about it more later, although it's not exactly relevant to this talk. They came from these parts of the rainforest. And there's probably a lot of other things hiding in there because there's so many different animals that harbor so many different types of viruses. Let's also talk about, it's not just habitat destruction that we're worried about in the Congo. It is estimated that 5 million metric tons of bushmeat are consumed every year in the Congo. So I want to take a deep breath because we're about halfway through and the human attention span can go about 30 minutes. So let's take a deep breath and contemplate what 5 million metric tons means. To me, a metric ton doesn't mean anything. I don't use the metric system. I don't know what that is. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. One of the high school students. How much is a kilogram in pounds? 2.2, very good. One chimpanzee weighs 50 kilograms. So 5 million metric tons per year of chimpanzee consumed is the equivalent of 100 million chimpanzees being removed from the Congo every year for human consumption. 100 million is still a difficult number to fathom, so to put it in context, that is more than there are people who live in Egypt, Germany, or the Congo itself. That is how many chimpanzees, or equivalent, gorillas are larger, bats are smaller, are being consumed in the Congo every year. And that is a problem. So I have a colleague from Cameroon, which again is right here, right next to the Congo, where HIV came from. And she said, she's about 50, 45, something like that. Don't tell her I said that. When she was a girl, a young girl, she said you could get bushmeat everywhere. It was available everywhere. You could just get it, and they loved it. Now it's much harder. You have to go a lot further because the animals have been killed off so much, and it's much harder to find. All right, let's talk about the state of bats in Africa because, and how the biodiversity decline could be potentially affecting them. So bats are actually a huge order. A fifth of all known mammal species are bats. There are currently over 1,000 species in the world. And in Africa and Asia, they are commonly hunted for food, including in this particular outbreak, almost certainly came from hunting a bat. There are 219 species in Africa. 1 is already extinct. 41 is nearly extinct, endangered, critically endangered, and 33 are close. So we have almost half, almost a third of the bat species are being wiped out in Africa today. As one example, this particular species has declined from 250,000 individuals to 40,000 in Uganda in only 40 years. In the Philippines, again, a totally different continent, researchers that went there in the 1920s saw that there were 150,000 in individual roosts. You go into a cave, you see 150,000 bats. Today, they went in, or in 1987 they went in, they found groups no larger than a few hundred. In the Philippines, bats are just as commonly eaten as in Africa. So there is significant bat decline, which could lead to either of those. It could lead to either the biodiversity argument or the bottleneck argument. Now, bushmeat hunting does not only happen in Africa. This is the wild, 10 years ago, China went through this era that they called the era of wild flavor, where they didn't want to just eat chickens and cows. They wanted to eat very exotic animals. The civet cat, for example, became a popular delicacy. The civet cat also carried SARS. So you'll remember SARS from the terrible outbreak in 2003 that was really scary. Fortunately, it burned itself out, but that came from the Chinese meat markets. Now, China has clamped down on this a little bit, but they still go through periods where they cull, which means they have to kill because of a SARS concern, thousands of these civet cats that are kept in these wildlife markets. So let's talk about, so now we talked about a variety of things. Let's just talk one more thing about extinctions. I've led into this, but let's talk about the rate of extinctions today. And this affects especially the young people in here. This is the world that our parents have left us, so you can thank them tonight. There are currently 2 to 100 million known species, or there's 1.5 million known species on Earth, and it's estimated there are about 100 million species. The background rate of extinction from the fossil record is believed to be about this, about 1/100,000th of 1%, which means about 1 species per year if, given the 100 million figure. The current rate of extinction is at least 1,000 times that, and maybe 10,000 times faster than what it's supposed to be. So that means, by a conservative estimate, if there are the fewest number of species that we believe there are, 2 million, and we have the slowest possible current rate of extinction, that means that 200 species go extinct a year. That is the low estimate. Every other day, 1 species goes extinct in the world. If you take the high estimate, I won't do the math for you, but that means 1 species goes extinct every 11 minutes, which means by the end of this talk, 6 species will have disappeared from the Earth. These are 3 species that we are in danger of losing. This beautiful animal is the Yangtze Finless porpoise. It's one of the few dolphin relatives that live in fresh water. They just lost their Yangtze River dolphin. There's 1,500 of them left. There's only 210 left of this Madagascar lemur, only 60 in the wild. And there are 1 of these just died at the San Diego Zoo, and there are only 5 left northern white rhinos in the world. And if you can believe it, they're actually still hunted for their horns. Now, why are all these animals going extinct? Well, the World Wildlife Federation came out with a report last year in which the headline finding was that half of all mammals on Earth, wild, has been cut in half in 40 years. The number of wild mammals on Earth has gone down by 50% in the last 40 years. And if you look at what the reasons for that are, the largest single reason, 37% of that decline, is what they call exploitation, which basically means hunting, poaching, bushmeat, etc. 31% is that other slide, the habitat destruction that we showed you. And then we have smaller issues. These are habitat loss completely, climate change, disease, of course, which we now know is a problem, pollution, etc. So, I've already alluded to this, but this is how bats roost together in a cave. And you can imagine how if there's a virus that could potentially spread, if you have a lot of different bats in the same cave, you might only have some of the same species, thereby others getting in the way of the virus propagation. But if you kill off a bunch of bats, you're going to have a higher concentration of individual species in any given cave, and this is a great way for a virus to propagate. They're so close together, they're probably biting each other a lot, they're probably urinating on each other a lot. The bats are a wonderful host for viruses because of their behavior. And in case you're wondering whether this is theoretical or actual, so it's actual. So in 2012, they discovered Marburg in bats in Kitaka Cave in Uganda. And the miners in that cave thought, we don't want all these Marburg-carrying bats because we don't want Ebola. Let's kill all the bats. So they put nets over the exit of the cave. They waited for all the bats to come out. They trapped them and killed them and sold them for meat. Well, then they removed the nets, and the bats came back. And what they found, while there were way fewer bats in there than before, the prevalence of Marburg infection had gone up in the bats in that cave. So those attempts don't work, and led to, sort of feeds right into that biodiversity argument we talked about. So I've already sort of given it away, which the right answer is, but I'm going to pretend I still have you in suspense. So remember that the dilemma was between why Ebola is so recent, where it came from. It's either a genetic bottleneck as proposed in the literature, or it's this decline of biodiversity, which we've given evidence for how that happens. So to resolve that dilemma, what I need is a fast mutating RNA virus that mutates just as fast as Ebola, but comes in a species that has never experienced a bottleneck and is also low biodiversity. If the bottleneck argument is right, and the species has never undergone a bottleneck, this virus should have a very diverse ancient lineage. But if the biodiversity argument is right, then this species should have a very recent common ancestor, just like Ebola, because it has a low effective population size. A new virus could spread very easily and become the dominant form. So we have one of those. Who can tell me what disease this child has? It's in the news today. Measles, that's right. So measles mutates just as fast as Ebola and causes a very unpleasant disease. So this is a family tree, remember all those, of measles. Measles evolved from rinderpest, which is a virus of cows, and it came about 1,100 years ago. And despite the fact that rinderpest diverged from measles almost 1,000 years ago, all current measles strains, whether it's from Zambia in 1957 or North America today, they are all from a single most recent common ancestor 100 years ago, just like Ebola. And this says that it's not the bottleneck argument like is proposed, it's biodiversity. These things are mutating all the time. They've been mutating all the time forever. A new one comes up that is just a little bit faster and able to spread, and it spreads so quickly because there's nothing to get in its way. Because humans are traveling all over the world. SARS came from Hong Kong to the United States very quickly, and so did Ebola, and so did measles. So this really shows that biodiversity is the answer. The decline of biodiversity is the answer for where Ebola came from. And now we have to talk about what that means. So just to summarize, I think I already summarized this, so I sort of want to save time. I summarized the argument for you. Low genetic diversity, biodiversity is declining rapidly, which could enable the propagation of that random strain. But now, that is not the only thing that brought us Ebola. We have so this is what I would call a slow motion emergency. It is an absolute emergency that all of those animals are going extinct and that the rainforests are being cut down and that new viruses are coming on us, not just Ebola, but dengue, Marburg, HIV, SARS, bird flu. I could go on for a long time. But we're not doing anything about it. It's an emergency in slow motion. And, when is the last time you heard a politician or a news anchor talking consistently about this? And especially think about this. What does this mean about the fact that there are an estimated 300,000 animal viruses that have yet to be discovered, mostly in biodiverse areas that are under the greatest threat, like the Congo, including HIV. We already experienced that one, and it wasn't very fun. So this is just a list of slow motion emergencies that are in front of your world today. Fresh water shortage is a good one. That's a problem. We're overdoing our fresh water drawing. Yemen, a country in the news today, is projected to run out of water this decade. It is drawing up all of its groundwater, and by the way, it is causing problems. Just got overtaken by a rebellion. But what is Yemen doing about it? Really nothing. If you look at the news, Yemen knows they have a water problem, and they aren't really doing anything about it. The classic case of a slow motion emergency which really caused the human population to collapse is Easter Island. If you don't know this story, ask me about it, the questions, because this is a beautiful story that really everyone should read. It's fascinating. So remember I talked about awareness and why aren't we talking about this? So this is the kind of thing that's in the news today, dominating the news every day, right? How about this one? That we saw that AirAsia jet every day for like 2-3 weeks? Or how about this one that dominated CNN for every day for 3 months? The story in Southeast Asia is not plane crashes. The story in Southeast Asia is unbelievable biodiversity decline and rainforest decline. A lot of the new viruses, including dengue, are from Southeast Asia. And look, this whole area used to be green, and it's brown. And the only rainforest left is on the island of Borneo. The entire island used to be a forest, and it's not anymore. And again, the brightest red is in Southeast Asia on the threatened mammal and threatened bird map. So that's one problem, is that nobody's talking about this. The media's not talking about it. The government's not talking about it. Nobody's talking about it. So this is my last slide. So if you were to ask me, what can we do about this? My answer is that the answer is what is called sustainable development. We know that there are 7 billion people on the Earth. There are going to be more in the next couple years. In addition, countries are getting richer. They expect to eat more protein, such as animals. What we have to do, we have not developed in a sustainable manner, vis-a-vis, look at the amount of CO2 and other fossil fuels that the rich world burns. We have to find a way to develop, because human beings are going to develop. No one's going to allow themselves to be kept poor while others are rich. No one would allow that. But we have to allow ourselves to get richer in a sustainable way that doesn't threaten our very existence. And this is just one example. I mentioned overpopulation, which certainly has helped humans walk into the forest and need more food and put more pressure on the rainforest. This is just a graph. As countries get richer, the fertility rate, the number of births per woman, which is how it's measured, goes down pretty dramatically. In poor countries, the fertility rate is around 6 children for every woman. And in rich countries, it's closer to 2 or even below 2. So as countries get richer, they do stop growing, and hopefully the human population will stabilize. But that is not the only thing we have to do. There are obviously many other things. I alluded to the issue of Yemen's fresh water. I could allude to many other incredible challenges that nobody is talking about, because humans are not very good at dealing with things unless they are in a short term, fit our attention span, or grab interesting news headlines. So that's it. I want to acknowledge these people. Also, this book is a really fine book, would give a great introduction to a lot of this stuff. Again, his story of the origins of HIV is just awesome, and I couldn't recommend it more. His story of Nipah virus is also quite interesting and certainly worth reading. And then I could also recommend one other book that I didn't put up here, but is relevant to this. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't exhaust you. And I love the question and answer session. So I would open it to questions and interested to hear your thoughts and concerns.
As it is time for Q&A, we are recording tonight, so Captain, if you wouldn't mind repeating the question.
Certainly.
So that that's captured, that's fine. Anyone want to open it up? So why don't you tell us about Easter Island?
Okay, Easter Island. So Easter Island. Okay, long story short, but so the other book that I would recommend is Collapse by Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond is the same guy that wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. And the point of Collapse is a lot of humans will say, oh, we don't need to worry about environmental concerns because we'll invent our way out of it, or we'll find new technologies, or it's not as bad as we think, whatever. Easter Island, let's go back and find that beautiful statue. Easter Island is a tiny island, incredibly remote in the Pacific, that used to be covered in forests. It was discovered by Polynesians about 2,000 years ago, and the Polynesians set up building a really great civilization. They built these heads all over the island, and to make these statues, they needed to transport them over long distances. And so in order to do that, they cut down trees, and the trees were used for transport and for canoes, etc. And over time, because of relatively low rainfall, the humans cut down all the trees on Easter Island. I don't have a picture of it, but if you Google Easter Island, you look at a picture of it, it is completely deforested. It's the only deforested island completely in the South Pacific. And what happened was they needed the trees for everything. I mentioned canoes to go get fish, food. They also used trees for the actual food that they themselves provided. And what happened was this civilization was at its great height. There were a lot of people on it. And suddenly they ran out of the thing they needed to sustain themselves. And it collapsed into civil war between the 12 different clans that lived on the island, cannibalism, and basically the decline of population by over 95%. Europeans showed up by boat in about 1700 or so. They found a few people left who were cannibals, and that's how they survived. And the point of collapse is not every human civilization deals with their problems effectively. And there is real consequences if you don't deal with the slow motion emergencies that you have to be concerned about. And one of Jared Diamond's most brilliant points in the article, he says, I wonder what the person who cut down the last tree on Easter Island was thinking. You know, what were they thinking as they cut down the very last tree on the island? Were they thinking, you know, this is my private property, you can't tell me what to do? Or were they thinking, you know, it's okay, we'll find another solution, we don't, you know, technology will save us?
I postulate they weren't thinking.
Or they weren't thinking. They could have been thinking a lot of things. But the point is, this civilization collapsed. The whole book of Collapse goes through not just Easter Island, but several, at least 10 human societies that at their peak of flourishing overstrained the environment that sustained them and subsequently collapsed. Takes you through Greenland, Norse, the ancient Maya, ancient Cambodia, etc. It's my favorite book. It's even better than Spillover, but apologies to Spillover author. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that these statues aren't just heads, but like whole bodies buried under the ground?
Is it true that these statues are not just heads, but whole bodies under the ground? I believe that is not true. I believe that these are, because what happened in the Civil War is these were their gods, more or less. This was their religion. They built huge ones, gigantic ones that were like at least a couple stories tall. And during the Civil War, they resorted to toppling the heads of the other clans. And so you can find that the heads are bent over. So it's just the head. Yes, ma'am.
Would you be able to take like a tree seed and go plant it over there, or is that like not allowed?
It's allowed. They are trying to reforest Easter Island, but it's a big island, doesn't get a lot of rainfall, and you can never reproduce the trees that used to be there. That was a whole separate species of trees that used to live there, and they're all extinct now. And you can get new trees from nearby islands, but once it's the thing about biodiversity. Once the species is gone, it never comes back.
Another question outside of the room? Yeah. So this is quite an overwhelming situation. I mean, we've got the short-term emergency situation in West Africa right now, but then there are much longer-term issues that we really do need to start addressing. What can we do as individuals or small communities around the world, apart from having to get the word out? I mean, where do you even start?
So that is a great question. So I want to answer that question with an anecdote. So I went to medical school at Columbia. I would say one of my intellectual heroes, in addition to Jared Diamond, is a guy named Jeff Sachs. He's an economist at Columbia. Jeff Sachs is pretty much the biggest name in the field of sustainable development. He's the special advisor to the United Nations on sustainable development, etc. I went to an event in which he was interviewing the UN Secretary General, the head of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. And Jeff Sachs asked Ban Ki-moon, you know, they were talking about issues like this, global warming, etc. And he asked Ban Ki-moon, you have a bunch of smart people out here in the audience that want to help. What can they do? And Ban Ki-moon said, call your senators, call your representatives, tell them what you think. And I was sitting out there in the audience thinking that was the absolute worst answer I could have possibly heard. Because unfortunately, that's the way he thinks. But all those smart people in the audience, the right answer is, especially young people that haven't picked a career yet, is to make this your career. There is we need so many people working on conservation, on sustainable development, on sustainable energy sources, on sustainable law, finding a way to actually enforce bushmeat bans, which they've tried and it's challenging to enforce. So I would say the first thing to do is to if you can, make this your career. Find a way into this field, know about it, and go into it. A lot of young people, because they don't know any better, they go into some field like medicine. And And unfortunately, that's because that's what their parents did, or that's what everyone in their community does. And medicine, law, and finance, which is the most common, the smartest kids always go into medicine, law, and finance. And that's a huge waste, in my opinion. So, there's some value in them. Obviously, there's probably some lawyers and doctors in here, including me. But I think that those aren't the only fields out there, and you don't realize it because those are the only things that are TV shows, and a lot of parents are those professions. But I would say that you get a PhD in conservation biology or something like that would be the way to go. And then also, what you individually consume, it makes a big difference if you drive a gigantic SUV or a small car that doesn't burn so much. It makes a big difference if you consume wild animals or import wild animal parts from other countries, as happens a lot in Asia. Now, the rhino is not dead because of climate change and deforestation. It's dead because the Chinese and the Vietnamese value its horn for ancient Chinese medicine. So those kind of things need to change, and things like that need to be worked on as well. Yes?
So I know Public Health Command send medics and scientists all around the world. In doing this type of work, what sort of, what training have your team members had? I mean, are they epidemiologists? Are they environmental? Just because you're talking about careers, what are the career paths in to work on problems like this? And how tackling one problem relies on so many different disciplines.
So the question is, what are the different career paths into this? So sustainable development, which I really think is the solution. That's a whole other topic for another day. I'd be happy to come give a talk about sustainable development. The basic theory of sustainable development is that you need a civilization to develop sustainably needs 6 pillars of sustainable development. Those 6 pillars are sustainable agriculture, which we don't practice right now, fresh water, education, healthcare, infrastructure such as roads and electricity, and business and economic development. You can work on any of those 6 fields. So if you go into agriculture, you can become an agricultural scientist and find sustainable farming practices. If you go into fresh water, boy, do we need fresh water people in the world. You want to become a teacher and go into education and help bring education to the world. And the reason that works, the reason the sustainable development model works, is because you need all 6 of those things to develop an economy. If you don't have healthcare, if you have all the other ones but you don't have good healthcare, the children are still all going to die of malaria or infant mortality, and you're not going to get a richer, healthier society. So sustainable development says that you need all 6 of those working at the same time. So you can get a PhD in any of those fields: education, healthcare, energy extraction. Preferably, if you're going to the energy industry, I encourage you to go into the renewable energy industry, because boy, do we have a dearth of appropriate renewable energy technologies today. So I would say those are the ways to do it. And if you go into healthcare, epidemiology is what I do, but clinical doctors to help control the Ebola outbreak, to help treat child disease. Those would be a variety of mechanisms as well. Sir?
That rhino, I think you said it was a white horn rhino. You said there's only 5 left in the world?
The northern white rhino, there are only 5 northern white rhinos left in the world. There were 6. One just died at the San Diego Zoo this year, and 3 live at a conservancy in Kenya, 1 in the Czech Republic, and I don't know where the last one is. But yes, there are only 5 left. They're trying to breed it, and not successfully. Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell us anything about the Army's participation in this assistance to Africa for Ebola?
Sure. So, by the way, I thought you were going to comment on his. So, did I sufficiently answer that question for you? And then I'll get to your answer.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are they trying to do anything about that?
Yeah, but it's hard if you only have 5 left and they all live in captivity. They're not very happy. Pandas, they're having a really hard time breeding pandas too, because the pandas aren't very happy. You wouldn't necessarily be at your best. Pandas don't breed very much anyway. And if they're kept in captivity, they tend to be kind of ornery and not want to do what they're told to do. So they've tried, for the rhinos, they've tried artificial insemination. They've tried putting the rhinos with different times of the year, and they're just failing. And they only have a few left, and they're all old, and it looks pretty bleak for the northern white rhino. Now, to your question. The U.S. Army was ordered by President Obama to go into Liberia. So there are 3 countries in West Africa where we have a really bad problem: Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. The United States is helping in Liberia only. The French are helping in Guinea, and the British are helping in Sierra Leone. The U.S. Army basically said, Ebola you can actually control pretty easily if you have a good public health system. For example, in the United States, we had Ebola imported, could have gone out of control like it did in West Africa, but it didn't because we had a pretty good public health response. And we had good hospitals to take care of people that got it. None of the Americans that got it died because the hospitals were really good. So we basically said, how can we leverage and bring that expertise, which helped control Ebola in the United States, to Liberia? So the United States went, and we built what are called Ebola treatment units for people to encourage people which had Ebola to show up, get treatment instead of staying home where they're going to vomit all over their floor and spread, and thereby, because it's spread by body fluids, spread it to their family members who then have to help bury them, and the traditional burial practices are a great way to transmit Ebola as well because they tend to be covered in the body fluids. So it was through building Ebola treatment units, helping to develop a public health system, helping with contact tracing, which is a huge deal. It's low tech, but it is the crucial thing to find everyone that's got Ebola and get them under treatment so they aren't out there in the community spewing Ebola-ridden fluids over everybody. That's pretty much what we did, and Liberia's come under control. Again, there's a graph, you can look at it. The Economist published a nice one. The cases went way up, and now the cases are almost down. They're not zero, but they're much lower than they were, and the trajectory is clearly in the right direction. Now, a lot of that is just because the virus sort of burned itself out in Liberia, but we helped, and hopefully we can have smaller, if not zero, outbreaks in the future. Yes, ma'am.
If we're able to successfully treat all people, all humans with Ebola, what do you see for the future of animals that are getting it?
So one proposal is that we would vaccinate all the gorillas. The problem with gorillas is they don't have a health system. They can't go to the hospital if they get sick. They're also much harder to find. So a vaccination is one option. If you had, it'd be pretty hard to bring you basically need an ICU, an intensive care unit, where you can intubate somebody, put a tube down their throat, give them IV fluids. It's pretty hard to do that for a gorilla, at least at a broad scale. So it's going to be a combination of prevention. So we need to stop the forces that are causing this. I mean, by the way, the western lowland gorilla that has experienced 2,000-fold outbreaks of Ebola is now critically endangered. So its population is not recovered because it doesn't breed that fast. It's going to be about preventing all future outbreaks by bringing these causes under control, stopping all of the encroachment into the forest. The problem is that the virus is in bats now, and the bats are clearly giving it to the gorillas, probably by sharing the same food. So that's a really hard one. I think it's going to be about vaccination and reforestation. If we were God and we could control everything, we would want to reforest and repopulate the endangered species that previously had the system in balance. Because again, Ebola was in bats forever. Ebola's been in bats forever, but it's only spilling into gorillas now, because otherwise you wouldn't see these kind of outbreaks. It would have co-evolved over time and become like the common cold. So, because again, not all Ebola will kill every animal, so just primates and bats for the most part. So, and an antelope relative. So that would be the proper solution, is vaccination plus environmental restoration, but it's hard. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned customs. Their customs in Liberia, for example, or something like that. Are they giving it to each other because of their customs, and do you have to educate them in a different way, and how is that working?
Yeah, so the question is about traditional practices that may be helping to spread Ebola. That's a huge problem. And what's really frustrating about it is every time there's an Ebola outbreak, we talk about the burial practices. So I wrote an article in the Baltimore Sun in which there was a story of a very prominent religious leader in Sierra Leone who died of Ebola. And the burial practice is to wash his body with water, and then the children from the village drank the water. It's going to be a very bad idea. Now, that's the traditional practice that has been around for a long time. The problem is if you, a Westerner, show up in your big suit, spray a bunch of disinfectant and say, don't do this, and by the way, and then a bunch of people start dying of Ebola, what happened in Guinea is a lot of people thought that the Westerners actually brought Ebola. And so there were threats against health workers, some actually died, some were attacked. So the messaging in this particular case, it was a disaster. So it's hard to criticize anybody because it was, catastrophe. The health system was not prepared for it, never been in West Africa before. And the human population, just the Westerners nor the local people were not prepared. But yeah, we need to do a better job of educating the public ahead of time so that if this happens, they trust people from the outside as well as the local people. But the crucial people in such a thing would be the local doctors, because they're the people that are going to understand the medicine, but also understand what you need to say culturally to understand. Because, so this is a great little anecdote that I'll just share because it's cute. So if you look at two different cultures, they're going to look at the same problem differently. There was a great experiment where they took Americans and Japanese. Japanese is a very different culture, and they had them look at an art picture of a fish tank, and they had them both describe it. And the Americans focused on the biggest fish in the tank. That was what they talked about. And they talked about its size and how it dominated the others, et cetera. The Japanese, when they look at the same picture, talk about the different, all the other little fish, and oh, this is what the background looked like, and these are the plants over here. They just have a very different way of looking at the problem than we do. One is not necessarily better than the other, but to realize the significant, obvious cultural gaps between West Africa or Central Africa and the United States or the WHO is really large, and we failed this time. And hopefully we've learned our lesson, but humans tend not to learn lessons, unfortunately, not fast enough. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about vaccination for gorillas. Has a vaccine for Ebola been found?
Well, we are testing the first one right now. So there are 3 phases. I don't need to go into that. To get a vaccine approved for humans, you need to go through different trials. The first trial has been completed. The second trial has been completed. The third one is now being tested in Sierra Leone right now. Cases just got shipped out this month. It may work. We're hoping it works. It might not because it mutates so quickly, and we have a tough time finding good vaccines for viruses that mutate this quickly. So boy, do we hope it works for gorillas. We have evidence that it might, but we've been disappointed by vaccines before. So we don't know the answer to that yet.
Is that one just for gorillas, or is it for humans?
It'd be the same exact vaccine. That would be the proposal.
There are at least 3 American companies that are developing an Ebola vaccine. Until now, there hasn't been a compelling need to develop it fully. So now there's a race to get through some of these clinical trials, and also the manufacturing and scale-up, which are significant issues for this type of treatment. So all that's being accelerated, and I believe your colleagues at USAMRID at Fort Detrick have been working on this, for decades, and on the similar viruses, Marburg. So there's a lot of activity, but it just takes time.
But don't get too comfortable, because we have not produced a good vaccine for HIV. We have not produced a good vaccine for dengue. We don't have a good vaccine for flu, because we need to change it every year. Those all mutate just as fast as Ebola. We don't have a good vaccine for malaria. Different bug, different type of bug. But we're having a tough time with, we do have a vaccine for measles, right? That works. So, although not everyone uses it. So, so maybe is our best hope. But, that's a Band-Aid, as you know. That's the Band-Aid on the real problem. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to the traditional custom for the children, did the children, have they already done the ceremony? And if they have, the children drink out of the bowl as? So
the question is, did this traditional burial practice that I talked about, where the children drank the water that was used to wash the body of a dead religious leader, did it already happen? Yes. And did the children die? In many cases, yes.
Well, if there's no more questions, is there one more question? No, if there's no more questions, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Captain Cohen for a really...
Thank you.
This is one of those issues where the more you know, the better you feel, actually, because you can start to think about potential solutions to what is a very, potentially very devastating problem, if it's allowed to spread. As a token of our thanks, please accept our lapel pin. And so you're covered for any social event, our T-shirt.
I need one of those.
So,
thank you very much. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Just a reminder, sorry, do that again.